My name is Professor Reginold Royston. I'm jointly appointed in the Department of African Cultural Studies and in the Information School here at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm so excited to present to you today a discussion on Africa and artificial intelligence technologies. This is also the official launch for the UW-Madison student organization called AI4Afrika-Wisconsin chapter. Sharif Issaka, who's our host who put this event together, will share more about that later. I would like to start today by stating that this is an academic exercise that is made possible by the University of Wisconsin, but the land that has allowed us to be here is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk Nation and people. We'd also like to acknowledge their original sovereignty and the sovereignty of the other indigenous peoples of Wisconsin, the legacy of genocide and removal, and the enduring triumph, and the sovereignty of the indigenous people of the lands where you reside. We also want to thank the African Studies Program, a Title VI African Studies Center at University of Wisconsin-Madison, which has generously lent their support and know-how to this event today, which will be recorded and made available to you at some time after this event. Thank you for your support, Dinah Famakina and Alea McCord. And thank you to the American Family Insurance Data Science Institute, which helped us promote this event. Excuse me. Sharif and I are doing this work as members of the AI4Afrika Collaborative. This is an organization of more than 40 scholars, artists, and thinkers, such as our guest, Professor Josse Cossa, artists and practitioners which includes developers and AI enthusiasts all over the world, including from Africa, of course. At UW-Madison, we also have the oldest African Studies department in the country, founded by giants of the field, such as John Vansina and the late great Teju Olanyan. We offer innovative courses in the anthropology of Africa, literature, technology, and new media studies, film, music, and in direct instruction in some of the most popular languages on the continent, including Yoruba, Swahili, and Arabic. So I do invite some of you who are students or those who are considering graduate school to find out more about us at african.wisc.edu. Okay, Sharif is one of our African Studies, one of the African Studies program's inaugural Racial Justice Fellows, and I'll hand it over to him and he'll introduce the event to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for ushering us into the event, Professor Royston. Technology, especially artificial intelligence, that is AI, promises to serve as a catalyst for global development and a platform for equal opportunities for all citizens of the world. However, AI is still a long way from materializing this promise, largely because of human-induced biases that is exacerbated by underrepresentation in the creation process. AI4Afrika-Wisconsin is a change-oriented team of innovators, mostly undergraduate students who want to create responsible, equitable, and accessible technologies. We are guided by the African concept of Ubuntu, a belief that affirms the positive values of community, of difference, of anti-racism, of hospitality, and openness to others. AI4Afrika-Wisconsin seeks to amplify the voices, ideologies, and ways of life of the Africana community, not just in Africa, but all persons of African descent around the globe. Our goal is to create a space for the discourse around equitable ways of building and using technology, especially AI. And this panel discussion clearly is a step towards achieving that goal. This is our first public event as AI4Afrika-Wisconsin, and we are excited to interact and learn from our guest panelists who will help us realize this vision. AI4Afrika-Wisconsin also offers free intelligent system solution to projects, nonprofit organizations, and social enterprises that are seeking to leverage different technological resources, such as websites, mobile apps, and machine learning models in addressing issues that are geared towards social good. We are currently seeking collaborators, project developers, technologists, advisors, and funding to help our organization grow. Please contact us through the links I'll drop in the chat very soon. And we are especially looking for students and young entrepreneurs at UW or in the Midwest to help realize our vision. Without much ado, I would like to pass it on to my dear colleague, Key, to introduce our first presenter.
Thank you, Sharif. Our first presenter is Dr. Josse Cossa. He is a Mozambican scholar, writer, researcher, poet, blogger, Twitterer, podcaster, entrepreneur, and associate professor in the College of Education at Pennsylvania State University. Most recently, Cossa served as a visiting associate professor in the Graduate School of Education at the American University in Cairo and a senior lecturer at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. Cossa holds a PhD in Cultural and Educational Policy Studies with a depth area in Comparative and International Education from Loyola University, Chicago. He is the author of book Power, Politics in Higher Education, International Regimes, Local Governments, and Educational Autonomy. He is the recipient of 2012 Joyce King Award for Distinguished Research on People of African Descent, awarded by the Comparative and International Education Society, and a member of MacArthur Foundation 100 and Change panel of judge for 2 consecutive competitions. Now let's welcome Dr. Cossa.
Thank you very much, Key, and thank you, Sharif. Thank you, Dr. Royston, and everyone who has organized Diana, and everyone who organized this panel and event. Thank you, every guest who's here. I am very honored to take part in this conversation. I want to, start by saying that I am originally from Mozambique, and I've having grown up in Mozambique, I am centered on African thought and living and perception of everything around me. And so justice has been at the core of what I do and how I, address issues and live my life. And at some point, some may wonder, why are you even thinking about AI? I mean, because AI really does affect all of us. But I've also worked with NSF programs on broadening participation in computing several years ago. That worked with different universities across the country. So technology is very critical, very important, and then it's also part of what I think about and on so many levels. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it's there, but if not, yeah. So my talk is going to be looking at how Ubuntu really does have a place in our hearts, as particularly as Africans. And so I wanted to first talk to you a little bit about that, because many times when we talk about technology, we don't necessarily think in terms of a philosophy and theory being a part of that which is, technology and so on, or technological. So I've been, very interested in bringing that perspective in, because theory does inform what we do and how we do things and how we explain even our own life and reality. And when Sharif and Dr. Royston talked to me, they tasked me with these 3 questions or 3 aspects. One is to really talk about Ubuntu, and the other is how it can be used to battle systematic racism, and also how can we use that to avoid it from creeping into AI, and how Ubuntu and Ubuntu-driven AI could be used for social justice. And all these are questions that are really important. And so the rationale for my work has been that we always talk about solutions. We often rush into ideas and then want to find a solution right away. And my take is always that Africa has had problems for a very long time, and so we cannot rush for solutions. we have to also be looking at some of the fundamental issues that have caused the problems that we have. And philosophical foundations such as the nature of knowledge and values and so on are very critical in our understanding of those eventual solutions that we are aspiring to do. But first, we have to tackle these ideas. We have to understand the notions that drive technology and so on and so on. And so, when we then begin to talk about artificial intelligence, and we only look at the technology, what we're actually missing is the fact that, in this artificial intelligence is what the term says, it's artificial. But what is important in that is that there is the aspect that is key, that is intelligence. Yet intelligence doesn't just exist in isolation. It exists because humans carry that particular thing. So this intelligence is what facilitates machine learning. This is what empowers machines with AI. And so not understanding what that intelligence, which we talk about, is, many times has led us to not address the root causes of these injustices that we then encounter when people invent technologies, when people begin to think in terms of what good technology looks like. And so because the human that we know today has been influenced by what's called modernity, and this comes from a very long tradition that was started, centuries ago, and this Cartesian dualism that emerged out of this idea of Descartes, which is, this realization that I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which really begins to define how we see ourselves as human beings. And so as a human being, you center, the realization of human is centered on this idea of the mind and thinking and the rationale. And so all of that begins to inform how we think about logic and even hierarchies of humans and so on and so on. And so what we begin to realize is that a lot of the injustices that occur that come through technology and how people are not really thinking in terms of technology as something that is important in terms of the roots of it, is that, they are conceptualizing technology through the lenses of humanism, of this cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And so if that's the way we think about the human, then we center it on the individual. And whereas what I'm interested in is to begin to talk about what we call Ubuntu, which differentiates itself from the idea of humanism, because Ubuntu basically says, umuntu ngemuntu ngabantu. So a person is a person, and to persons because of persons or through persons. And this differentiates itself from I think, therefore I am. So the being that is realized through thinking begins to not be the center of whatever a person that is living through Ubuntu, this perception of personhood through other or through fellow humans or because of fellow humans and so on. Then that person, when they think in terms of inventions or creating new technology or even modifying certain aspects of technology, they will be thinking in terms of what does it do to fellow humans. It is not simply what does it do to me? How does it benefit me? So the centrality of the one person, the individual, begins to collapse within this space of Ubuntu. So when you're thinking, and Ubuntu is rooted really historically through Sankofa, so you're thinking that all of this in Ubuntu, you don't only think in terms of the immediate person you see. So when you're thinking of inventing a cell phone, you're not just thinking, oh, I'm going to do this because it's good for my neighbors, for me, and for those who look like me. But you're also thinking in terms of interconnectedness of humans and how that the connectedness will then inform the way you're going to think about impact and how it's going to affect fellow humans. So when you think about what kinds of materials am I going to use, you're not just going to go to some place and extract the materials without thinking how is it going to influence the people that live in the place where I'm extracting the materials. You're also not going to be you're going to be thinking carefully about toxic waste. What the stuff after I've invented this technology, what happens to it at a certain point in the course of its life? Is there going to be a point when I have to recycle, I have to throw it away, I have, what are the aspects of it that have to be dumped? And so you think in terms of that if you think through these kinds of questions in an Ubuntu fashion, then you are no longer just looking at places as commodities, looking at certain, just at your own interest, but you're thinking of the impact it's going to have on fellow humans. So toxic waste is going to be toxic waste anywhere on the planet and anywhere, even in the universe. And I say in the universe because when if you embrace an Ubuntu perspective, you're going to be thinking differently about the relationships between humans and the non-human forms. Because within the African conceptualization, within Ubuntu, we don't think of the human as the one individual physical body. We also think in terms of, and it's not just thinking in terms of community. When one of the arguments I make is that there is no individual in Ubuntu, because when a person walks into a space in an Ubuntu world, you walking in with your ancestors. Our perception is that I am not walking alone. I'm walking alone. I'm walking in with my ancestors. I'm walking in with the spirit world. I'm walking in with all of those non-life forms. So land is connected to humanity. Non-physical bodies are connected to humanity. The entire cosmology is connected to humanity. So the decisions I make are not just about me and my neighbors and my friends and the people who look like me, and not even just about me and fellow human beings, are also about all of us with the universe. So you think about environmental constraints in a different way. You no longer just wanting to mitigate issues, you cause the problems and then come back and try to work through some of these issues. But you're no longer looking at the invention, damage, remediation, complacency types of cycles that we have gone through for so long, and then creating some sort of ethics to kind of justify even the way that we're going to be work, so that we can continue doing what we're doing, because now we have a set of ethics in place. You think through Ubuntu, you're already walking through a very different kind of ethical space, because your entire existence is connected to everything around you, to everything in the universe. And so that's going to change the way we think about AI. And we're not, and so this is part of my, what I'm really hoping that we get to do is that we foster conversations, we begin to think in terms of how is what I'm doing going to impact the world in which I live. And the one paradigm I know to be as one that Africa can offer the world, that Africa presents to the world, that has been ignored and even in many ways even downgraded to something that is of no value at all, is Ubuntu. And Ubuntu has offered Africans a lot of resilience. And in part of how we still here is because of the way we think about, the way we think and feel and live our lives through Ubuntu. So important that we continue to engage in this. And I'm hoping that we'll have more of a conversation through all this. But I do want to make very clear that the differentiation between the paths you're going to take, if you're going to be thinking through technology, AI, through the lenses of humanism and modernity, you are likely to continue to make the mistakes that we have made for centuries, for, you know, as we walk through that paradigm, because it is a paradigm that does nurture personal individuation. It nurtures this cultural justification or rationalization. So you rationalize the why we have different, why some cultures are more valuable than others. And we create a culture that actually justifies racism and gender bias and all sorts of other, you know, why do I have to be able to, and I have the right as a citizen of a particular group to do certain things and others don't have rights. So it's all embedded in a very modernistic, you know, humanistic sense of way of looking at life, and how the classification of humans is critical, you know, so the structural differentiation is important. So you're gonna always wanna differentiate yourself. When you do embark in AI, you're gonna be thinking in terms of using AI to differentiate yourself from other fellow humans. But if you enter through the paradigm of Ubuntu, all these things are not a part of it. And so you're thinking in terms of a person being a person because of through persons and with persons. And you're also thinking in terms of the person being connected to life forms of various sorts, of all sorts, basically, and to the universe in general. And so every technology you're gonna be inventing or conceptualizing is going to have this very critical way of perception, or is gonna be embedded in a very humane and even just, you know, fair kind of way of thinking and doing things. And so I will stop there, and hopefully we can have more of a conversation later on. But I hope, yes, if you have any questions, then we can engage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cossa, for teaching us the Ubuntu and the Ubuntu approach. So our next presenter is Nyalleng Moorosi. Nyalleng is a software engineer and a researcher at the Google AI team in Accra, Ghana. Since joining the Accra team, Nyalleng has been working on projects related to inclusion and fairness in AI, as well as application of AI understanding cities in Africa through satellite images. Nyalleng is an active member of Black in Artificial Intelligence Group and an organizing member of Deep Learning Indaba, a yearly workshop that gathers African researchers in one space to share ideas and grow machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities. Before joining Google, Nyalleng was a senior data science researcher at South Africa's National Science Lab, Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, or CSIR. In her capacity at CSIR, she worked on projects ranging from rhino poaching prevention to biomarker detection in Africa cancer proteomes. Before getting into machine learning research at CSIR, she was a computer science lecturer at Fort Hare University and a software engineer at Thomson Reuters. Now let's welcome Nyalleng.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Sherry, for inviting me. And thank you to all the organizers, Professor Royston. And thank you. I'm so glad that I come in after Professor Cossa on that to talk to you about, and today I think quite a lot of it is going to be about my thoughts, and these thoughts come out of revelations from doing the work that I've been doing, both in South Africa and now in Ghana, and maybe a little bit while I was in the US. So as case, I've never heard a longer biography. So But anyways, I'm Nyalleng Moorosi. I'm originally from Lesotho. So, hey, Southern African fellow person. I see you, even though West Africa has adopted me now. I'm originally from Lesotho. I'm actually Dumelandat. So I'm actually, but I'm calling in from South Africa currently. I'm going to try to have a presentation. It's going to be short. It's just going to be like a summary of what I'm thinking. I am quite bad at Zoom, so I know it does say that I'm a software engineer, but we are going to disregard that for a little bit while I try to figure out how to present. Okay, share screen, right, in green. Just a minute. I know we're like tight on time. Okay. Okay. How's that? Okay, great. So I've titled today's talk Centering the Margins, because I think this is where my thoughts are starting to be especially after just working in the continent. So I came back home, i.e. to the continent, but I came back to Southern Africa about 10 years ago. So I've been working as either a lecturer or a researcher for the past 10 years. And the reason I joined Google was because I was doing a lot of applied work, but I wanted to get back into the research, open the black box and try to see, some of these tools that we're working on and how they are being implemented. So since I joined Google, I haven't done a lot of data science. I have mostly been working with fairness and inclusion with the Ethical AI team. But I'm going to talk about the projects that I did both there and some of the work that I have done since then. So the reason why the margins for me are so important, I think it's because of like the two places where I've spent my most amount of time. One being the United States and the other being Southern Africa, and specifically really quite surrounded by South Africa or being in South Africa itself. And many people, I'm sure, in the audience are quite aware of the history of South Africa. And of course, you are living the history and the presence of the United States. And both of these countries are two countries where working with the average doesn't really tell you much, because you have got such a disparity of lives, such a disparity of experiences. And so when you're thinking about building these automated systems, and a lot of the time when we're working in machine learning, we're trying to optimize the average. But in fact, trying to optimize the average in both of these two places is not it's not as useful as maybe in other places where the average really contains the majority, or contains really the body, or whether the average is quite representative of the population. And so I wanted to talk about three things that I've been thinking about, which we as Africans in this space truly have to capture. The first thing is we have to rethink the questions that we ask. The questions we investigate, the questions that we prioritize as like the top questions to answer in research. There are specific questions right now that are outstanding that people who are doing research in machine learning really feel are very important questions. Questions of fairness and ethics of AI are actually very big right now. But we also have questions such as, can you create systems that self-supervise? So self-supervised or semi-supervised learning is another thing that's very big. But I think we also should, as Africans, should take a little bit of space, step back a little bit and think about what are the questions that are important? What kind of systems do we want to automate? What kind of systems do we not want to? What kind of evaluations do we want to apply to our work? How do we measure goodness of fit in our space? And so I'll give you an example. So for example, in my time in South Africa, one of the questions I was fascinated by was the legacy of spatial apartheid. And this is really how I got started with with satellite imagery and understanding cities and the work that led down that path. But for people who may not know, spatial apartheid was, there was a law in South Africa that said that Black people have to live different and separate places from white people in South Africa. And the economic spaces, those two economic spaces were distinctly different when one was fairly wealthy and one was very deprived. And so, for example, if you look here, you're seeing satellite images of places in South Africa. One, fairly wealthy, as you can see, and the other one not at all. And so what we wanted to see was, obviously, spatial apartheid was disallowed in 1994 when the country came to be a democracy. And but we wanted to see what are the remnants, what do the cities look like now? We are well over 20 years past this. And so we wanted to see what has changed, what has not changed, what seems to be the factors that lead to neighborhoods changing and thriving and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of problem that would only be asked by people who live in South Africa, I think, because this is a question that is very pertinent to people in South Africa. But this is a question that's very important and can lead down to, how you plan the city, how you provide services, who your people, and all of these kinds of things. This was a question that's very pertinent for us. So actually here, this is a plot of like one of what we call a township, which was the historically Black places in South Africa. So this one is actually by the biggest airport in the country. And so you start to see some of these changes. So the technology itself is actually very similar to the other technology that's being used everywhere else about satellite imagery and computer vision. But what is important is the question. And once you change the question, you have to change the evaluation method and you change what you regard as the ground truth. The second thing, actually, so the other question that I got really interested in, and this is work that I actually did while I'm now in Ghana, was what happens when we compress a model? So we have these massive models, but for the populations in Africa, for the majority of people here, for the majority of people that are running startups, a big model is not going to be very useful because a lot of the technology has to be mobile, it has to go into the phone. And so I was very interested in what do we lose when we compress? When models get compressed, which data sets fall off? And we actually found that very important data sets, so underrepresented data sets fall off. We don't see them, we get errors, we mislabel, we do all kinds of things. So it used to be before that, compression, like models that are being compressed were regarded as the answer to a lot of the questions. And they are, because they consume less energy, they're more portable, et cetera, et cetera. But their evaluation metric was such that if the average stayed high, then you were good to go. So for example, you would lose you'd move from a model that's 100%, the whole massive thing, compress it and remove 99% of the information that you have to remember about this model, only stay with 1%, and you would lose something that is around 5% precision on average. But when you look further inside, you start to see that there are some specific classes of data where they would lose more than something like between 10 to 30%. So these are massive, but those data points would be so little that they do not impact the average as much. But when you are one of the people who are in that long tail, who are in the underrepresented classes, that actually can be very consequential. So that's that. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about what we have to think and think about differently is about metrics and definitions. This is something that is very pertinent for the work in fairness, because work in fairness is very value laden. We decide what is right, we decide what is fair, and we decide how far back we want to check for this fairness metrics. And once again, like I said, we decide what, not just in fairness, but in everywhere, we decide on ground truth. So one of the things we learned when we were studying these townships and how they've changed in South Africa was how they had been mislabeled in the literature. We had the benefit of having seen and lived in these spaces, and so we could correct that. And so it was very important. So we knew the ground truth. We were not inheriting the ground truth from somewhere else. And I think this is something that we underemphasize about the importance of studying the environment that is around us, something that we know very well, because once you have decided what the ground truth is, everything else is set. So it's very important to decide on what we are going to regard as the truth and what we are going to decide as the values we want to do. Because once we automate, we're going to magnify and we're going to perpetuate. This is what automation does. And so there is this really nice quote, which I sometimes use about from, and actually I think I might have two of these. It's an artifact of the fact that I've just been reading his works and they just fit in so nicely. But it's this idea of that we cannot, no one group of people can be the decider of the truth for all the other groups of people. And we, the people, have got to participate in deciding what is the truth and what is the thing we are going to automate and implant into our systems. So when we were here in South Africa going through all of these things, all of this sort of thing of figuring out that actually, hey, we are here, we are defining the problem, defining the ground truth, we're doing all of this sort of things, we realized obviously we were too few. And so the thing that we do was we actually built a network of machine learning practitioners in Africa. And so in 2017, we decided that we want to train Africans on the fundamentals of machine learning, to really understand what's going on under the hood, so that they can decide on the problems that are important and how they want to change these systems, the kind of models they want running in their neighborhood, and classifying them. Now, I'm almost at the very end here, and it's actually very interesting that Professor Cossa here is talking about, Ubuntu, because this is exactly about it, about how the metrics change when you adopt the systems from the West to Africa. And we have to take these into consideration. And so this is, and I cannot emphasize enough, like how much things change when you change the lens. So for example, there's very nice work by Gandhi, and he describes how when we start to compute, what we're doing is we were actually providing rationalization for discrimination. And for places such as where I am right now in South Africa, when you run automation systems, what are you running them on? Because the historical data is so distorted. And so this is yet another reason why, like, for me, it's all about center the margin, center the people. And it's crazy here in Africa that we think like, these systems are still treating Black people as the margin, when in fact they are the center, they are the majority. It shouldn't be that the products that are running here, they still don't fully work for this environment. But I think that actually is an assignment for us. So we have two choices. We can try to fix the systems that are already here, which is going to be 1,000 times harder, I believe, than actually trying to build our own systems. And that's that. Thank you for this. It was a lot longer than I thought, but thank you for listening. That will be it.
Thank you very much, Nyalleng, for teaching us about your work you're doing. It's really amazing what you're doing. At this point, I'd like Professor Royston to start us off with some questions.
Yes. Okay. Where's my controls? Oops. Hi. Oh, I'm live. My mic is live. Okay, great, wonderful. And I am live. Okay, good. Thank you, Nyalleng, and thank you, Professor Cossa. Thank you, Nyalleng. This is really fascinating ideas that we are interacting here with, how to make AI relevant for Africa, and perhaps we can think the ways that it can be relevant quite broadly. So I have several questions that I would like to bring into this discussion. The first would be, is the incorporation of marginalized data that you're talking about, Nyalleng, is that a technical fix, or is that a socio and cultural fix as well? Okay. There's other big, very, very often cited issues and questions with regards to data and information in Africa. So I'm a professor of new media studies, and I study data organization. I also do research on the ground in places like Ghana, where technology is offered as a solution for a lot of social problems, often problems with infrastructure and development, right? And as you have stated, you know, Google's not only Google, but any, let's say, computational service is relying on a corpus of data in order to describe the problem and therefore suggest a solution. One of the big questions we have is, and the model is generally around data sets that are either publicly available or organized through an industry. Perhaps it's government, or perhaps it's the UN, or perhaps it's statistics from the oil industry and whatnot. How does Google deal with the problem of data in Africa? How do you source, or how do you construct a data corpus? In many ways, data is conceived of as something that we can, as the new oil, right, that we get from social media, perhaps, and the internet. And the internet penetration in Africa, in some places is as high as 80%, in some places it's as low as 15%. And even if we go to a model of mobile phone adoption, there are still wildly different adoption rates. And again, those databases are behind infrastructures which we don't always have access to. So it's a question of how do we get to the data if it's going to be useful in an African context, right? So yeah. A couple, so those are a few of the questions. I guess we can well, I'll let you speak, Nyalleng, and answer those questions. There's so many questions I have about how do we do this work of AI, but please.
Yeah, these are really, really good questions. And it's discussions like these where, but I guess this is recorded. So this is good because I think these are things like you listed quite a number of things, and these are things I would not want to forget. About the question of how Google sources data, Google sources data in many ways. And I have actually never worked inside Google on a project that did not use standard data sets. The reason being, well, actually I've worked on one project, but most of my work used standard, and I'll tell you how we got that data set. But mostly I've used the standard data sets. And the reason was because it was to evaluate some of these models. And so I wanted to use these standard data sets that other people have used to show how efficient they are in order to show that they actually leave a whole bunch of people behind. So that was that. So these are open source, like you're saying, these kinds of data sets. But I think also what's more important is like, what about some richer data sets? Because open source data sets tend to be used for like experimental. Some of them are toy data sets. Some of them are just collections of non-audited objects, and this is why there's sometimes all of these problems that come out from training from these data sets. So I've never actually done any of the other curated methods for that, like inside Google. But I've worked with other researchers who were working in the Turin. So I've done a study on trying to understand what habitat buildings look like in small section in Lagos. And this was data set. I was collaborating with geographers, so GIS people, and they had literally just gone down and walked the streets with communities and did that. And the whole point of why they did that was because they wanted to redefine what ground truth was. And I was already going through this whole idea of like, ground truth looks really different when you're walking the streets than when you're just being given data, for example, by the UN, etc. So that's, for example, how I got access to that kind of data. But I think the researchers themselves have it somewhat open. They are at the Turing Institute, and I think they're very collaborative. So we're able to do work that way. But I can tell you, when I was at CSIR before I went to Google, I did actually two things that you touched upon. One was applying technical solutions to problems that may not be technical. So that was the lesson that I learned from the rhino poaching exercise. We worked with the South African Rangers. So these are like for policing the parks. And this was at the biggest one, the biggest park in South Africa, the Kruger, which is a big economic hub for South Africa and for the community around. And the whole point was like trying to predict if there's going to be a poaching within like a kilometer square, because the park is huge. So, you know, there's only so much finer you can do things. And honestly, we got to a point where we had so many sensors and so many things that were automating and so many prediction things. And actually the poaching did decrease in that park. But what happened? The poaching just moved somewhere else. So the poaching just moved to the next province over. The poaching moved to Zimbabwe. You know, that's all that happened, because it was not a technical problem. It was a social problem. And so it was a problem of, you know, of need, of resources, of need of resources. And so that was one of the things that I learned. And so once again, this would then, for me, that gave me this whole importance of like evaluating goodness of fit. Because obviously the thing we were measuring was not the real problem, and therefore we didn't really solve the real problem. And in that space, that's when you walk away and you get, you know, people who actually know how to do this and do community planning and community organizing to actually step in before you automate.
How do you partner with those forces? I guess I'm curious how one partners with those cultural and on the ground, you know, people who know the knowledge, but also people who have the other resources to use with AI in those scenarios.
Well, I was lucky because I was working for the government, and the park rangers are part of the government. So, and I have come to really appreciate how good it is to work with the government, especially at some point of one's career. As I was telling this, I was invited earlier on by Sharif and other people. So yeah, so that was that. So we got access to this because we worked for the government, and the whole task of our unit was to try to solve social problems, was to try to solve community problems. And so that was that.
We have a couple questions in the chat. I do want to pose a question for Professor Cossa. We talk about Ubuntu, which is a ethnocultural or philosophical idea, and certainly in an African context, we can see the benefit, right? We thinking outside of the individual, thinking outside of quote unquote European modernity. And I wonder, as we know that China, for instance, is also one of the biggest implementers of AI, if not the most robust systems of AI implementation are in place in China. Can we use a similar ethno-philosophical approach to think about AI in China as well? As an analogy, right? Will that work, right? So if there's already kind of a narrative around collectivism, does Ubuntu offer a model for using other ethno-philosophical ideas to diversify AI approaches?
Yeah, so I have to start by saying that, you know, one of my favorite stories to tell is, you know, when the settlers came to Africa, they met Africans at, you know, down in the Southern African region, and they asked them the question, who are you? And the response was Bantu, people. And that particular response offered a different way of looking at humanity and cosmology in general, because the response was, we are people just as you are people. So it wasn't a categorization of a specific group of humans. What the Europeans did, because of the modernistic perception of human, they said, oh, so you are the Bantu people. And suddenly we have the people in Southern Africa.
Mislabeled.
What totally mislabeled. And what the reason I like to say to explain that is because when, and this is why I began to theorize through what I call Cosmomuntu, because when the Africans responded and said, we are people, we are Bantu, we all are Bantu, they were offering an alternative way of looking at the human, not only an African, but the human in general. And so that was a gift to the world. And had Europeans taken that gift, they would have thought differently about how to, engage in technology. There would have probably not been the kind of colonialism we've had. There may have been some sort of, because people do lose Ubuntu, right? And we do say when a person has already diverted from or kind of just moved away from the principles of Ubuntu, we say you have lost your Ubuntu. That's the way you say, and so we would have had a different world. And with that, the inventions would have been different. The idea, this culture of extraction would have been different. So when then you would think about developing, AI and all sorts of technology, you would be thinking about, what I said earlier, how do I develop this technology and who is involved in it? So humans are involved in it, and that's going to be global humans. It's not just going to be a particular group of people. What we witness with this space, and if we're not careful, what we witness with this space with China and so on, is that sometimes we fall prey of this non-critical idea that China has a very collectivistic way of thinking about the human. But if it were the case, we wouldn't be having the issues we have in Africa, on China-Africa relations, for instance. So I don't think it's a model to be emulated. I think, Africans have to be thinking of and engaging in a whole new paradigm, in a whole new way, which is based on the Ubuntu principle, and Nyalleng's presentation showed us that we have to begin to take initiative and move in that direction. Forget about these models. I mean, we can learn something from every model, but we cannot adopt the models and simply implement them, in our own context. So I think there is no model that is really fitting to this justice space yet. I haven't seen anything that is very, justice driven, even though we do conceptualize, we do say that universities throw all the social justice stuff, but Ubuntu offers an alternative. And there are other, of course, cosmologies around the world. Ubuntu is not the only one that have been relegated to the margins and to the exterior spaces. Modernity, that's what we should be learning from. And so I think, that's pretty much what I would say, that it's getting to the roots of it, because that's going to be determining, what directions we're going to take. And we will be teaching one another something we have not dared to teach one another yet, because we've been embarking on this very modernistic dominated space. So you have China, Japan, and other spaces that they're part of what some have argued to be multiple modernities. So they're still emulating the modernistic perspective, even though while embracing something like, Confucianist principles that are really, good principles, so the dominant paradigm still remains. And so we have to be careful about how to do that. And many times, the reason I use Cosmomuntu is because it's not, Ubuntu is not exclusivistic, but it also does not impose universalisms. So, and that's a very distinct, aspect. So we need to, I think we need to learn more from our own context and our own ancestral wisdom, and be careful about how we engage in this technology. And, we can talk about the data and conceptualizations of data. What is data? And Nyalleng talked about that, is there data in Africa? Is there, the extraction economy that exists now? So all of that, if we engage through Ubuntu, we would avoid a lot of these perils. That's pretty much.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Cossa. Nyalleng, would you like to comment on this? Okay, so right now we can ask Key to see if there are any questions in the chat or if anyone wants to ask a question. Key, please.
Yeah, so Damon, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Unmute.
We can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Damon. We're gonna have to, okay, come back to you. Yep, okay. There was a question. I see I see someone had a question about Ghana specifically.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. I think it's for Nyalleng. What are the main research projects at Google AI Accra?
Let's see, I'll try to remember them. So there's work on fundamental machine learning. This is work that's being led by Jan. And what he's trying to understand is, are there right paths that one can take at the beginning in order to train models optimally and faster? So this actually would be something that we would be interested in because we cut down on how much computation you need. Then there is work that is being led by John Quinn, and it's actually satellite imagery, trying to put the buildings that are not currently being automatically detected by the models on the map also. Part of why they're not being detected is because of like the structure of the building. If you're thinking about where the models came from before, they will not be used to some of our architecture. So that's improving these models that are being used internally to be able to recognize more houses. Then there's work, like I said, on fairness. There's work on understanding plant diseases. This was work that was led by Ernest, who is currently at Makerere, but yeah, so that was that to understand crop diseases. But I would say there is a certain type of person that wants to work for Google in Ghana. And I think that sort of person is usually somebody who is interested in developing solutions which can be adopted. So that was one of the things as researchers, I can't really say this was like company strategy, but we as the researchers who were sitting in the room, we decided that some of the projects that we want to work on will be projects which can be easily absorbed by the community around us. So for example, in building the model, we're trying to figure out, can we release more data sets? Can we release more models? Even if like halfway through or compressed or something like that. And then, so yeah. And then of course, like looking at different evaluations, these kind of flavor, very similar to some of my work, which is always informed by, what else can we do? We do a lot of teaching, of course. So we collaborate with the universities around University of Ghana, Ashesi, AIMS. So quite a number of us are affiliated with them. Informally affiliated. I actually don't know if anybody is formally affiliated, but informally we go there and give, we teach certain more like specific topics and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think that's been the thing. We've been there for like 2 years. So, and unfortunately COVID cut us at our knees. And so, yeah, but that's that. So I think you can do we do applied work, but also fundamental work as well.
And how particular are those? Is that data to either Ghana or Africa in particular, rather than kind of, as you said, fundamental research on AI pathways?
Like I said, there's people who do one or the other, and these sorts of things tend to overlap. So, for example, when looking at, like, I look at the problem of trying to map like buildings, trying to look at the built environment in Africa, right, using satellite imagery. So, trying to locate all of these. Of course, it can be extended in many other ways. But in the process of doing that, you actually have to improve fundamentally the computer vision, the computer vision models, in order for them to be able to activate, so that you don't have to, because part of the whole thing is that then they will be integrated into the system, so that Google as a company better understands, and other mapping places can better understand. One of the things that informed this kind of project, so the researcher who got started on working on this, he used to work with the UN on refugee settlements. And so, the UN is always kind of like trying to find where these people are in order to give them assistance. And so that was kind of like, I think, where he started working and thinking about how we can't always see these sorts of buildings. My responsibility, and the responsibility that we take where I'm collaborating with these kinds of projects with other people, also is to think about some of the ethical implications of doing this kind of work, especially when you're thinking about vulnerable people. And so internally, before we can even think of releasing anything, or we have to go through so many audits to be able to, to make sure that we're respecting these sorts of people. We're going through deciding what's the granularity at which you can share this sort of data. What do you label, what do you not label? So a lot of that kind of, so that would then be like the additional work that goes on top of just the computer vision models.
Thank you for the answer. So Damon, do you want to try it again?
Yes, I should be coming through right now. Y'all hear me? Holla if you hear me.
Yeah, I can
All
hear
right, cool. Listen, guys, I have so much to say. I'm going to be very brief. We need to connect. There's so much amazing stuff going on here. First thing I needed to say, when I first logged on and I saw you guys, I wasn't sure if I was going to come, because you know how we all are so pressed and stressed with all these different things. And even though Reg is my man, I'm also a professor in African cultural studies. And this topic is what I'm all about. I'm like, whatever, I know it all. I just have to put out my articles. And I'm so happy that my spirit overrode that logic, which of course is not logical at all. It's anti-Ubuntu. And what this really shows is, like, what you guys all are involved in is precisely, and I'm speaking about the different organizations that you mentioned at the beginning. And this is going to tie into my question for the second presenter. How do you pronounce your name?
Nyalleng.
Nyalleng. Okay. Nyalleng. Okay, Jose, that's a little easier. So yeah, I have a lot to say. I want to get involved in both of these organizations. I'm working on a number of projects and presentations that you all will be interested in. Here are my questions. Jose, when you're talking of the way you described Ubuntu, and then you said if the project was approached through Ubuntu rather than humanism, which is liberalism, which is essentialist individualism, denying the fact that the individual and the social, the broader community are always co-constructs and cannot be divorced from one another. My question to you is, what is the metric, what is the measure, what is the means by which we will, you are, or you're working towards, or we collectively are working towards having a way of identifying in a substance that something qualifies as Ubuntu or anti-Ubuntu in a substantive way, as opposed to in a lip service ideological way, as opposed to the way we have, you know, all these books on African studies, African cultural studies, musicology in Black communities that are bookended by, you know, this opening chapter on self-reflexivity, and I, as a white person, went over to, you know, whatever community, expropriated all the cultural knowledge, and I feel very bad about it. And, you know, that's at the beginning and the end, and then nothing in between. So how do we avoid that sort of ideological use, idealist use of the term as opposed, and have a metric that in a way that is substantive, both for us, and not just to evaluate, you know, afterwards and condemn all these colonizers, which of course we need to get more serious about doing, but in terms of decolonizing ourselves, you know, to and in a way of like working together to make sure our projects meet that meet those values, or in line with those values. Second question for the second presenter. Loved everything, so many questions. The last thing that you said was so powerful about, you know, if we try to correct all the existing errors, that's just not efficient. We're never going to get to it. We got to start from scratch, build from grassroots. So we got to do our AI projects, you know, by the community, for the community, by the people, for the people, right? Double Ubuntu. There's a lot of actually, a lot of symbolism we can get from that, you know, the people, because by the people, for the people, then who are the not so people? So even with that misunderstanding, there is some insight. Sorry, my question is, this resonated so much with, you know, as I'm trained in African-American studies. So in the history of African-American literature, as with African literature, we're always talking about, you know, through the Black arts movement, up through hip hop, and going back all the way to Harlem Renaissance and before, there is always the question of institutions. If we don't have our own institutions, our own organizations, if we are not the ones determining what counts as good quality, what meets the ethical standards, then we're constantly going to be fighting a losing battle, including in departments such as the esteemed one that we have right here in this oppressively white institution and state system. So the question is, doing this at Google, in Google, and so part of the question is, do you mean at Google, or do you mean these other side projects, or both, in terms of smaller AI, in terms of not general AI, but specific applications being created in local communities? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about applying this in a major corporation like Google? Is also a very interesting question. Over to you guys.
Should I go through the order in which you asked the questions? Okay, Nyalleng, yellow boy. So you know, the question you asked is is part of how we've been trained to even, you know, this is part of what we have to rethink about is, and I don't just mean you, I mean all of us, right? We've been trained in a very modernistic place. And so when we ask the questions that we ask through those lenses as well. So there is a certain amount of hegemonic dominance about on epistemology. So we think in terms of measurements, and the question we don't ask is what are those? What does measurement mean? And how does measurement look like? So Ubuntu isn't, you know, you can't necessarily measure it through the metrics of, you know, the humanistic, modernistic perception, because they want to see, and I've been an evaluator, so they want to see what are the common core indicators of all the stuff? How do you tell if this thing works, it doesn't work, right? Ubuntu is a lifestyle. So the only way to measure it is by living it. Like you on a daily basis, you immersed in this, and life will tell as you look through the scope of a project of, and the outcome of whatever it is that the AI or the product that's going to come out. That product will tell you whether it was built through Ubuntu lenses or not. And so, this is part of where, I take issue with foundations. Right now we're doing a lot of work in foundations, and it's been very critical. It's very really good stuff, but it's good stuff within the modernistic space, because now foundations are thinking about impact, right? So they say, well, if you're going to do projects, you have to tell us about the impact. So, impact evaluation is very important. But impact evaluation is really a one-way street. What we don't ask questions about is, when you're working with these communities, you're working with different communities, everywhere in the world, how are we all impacting one another? How are we influencing one another? And how does it look like after you have spent time together, learning, from one another, even those so-called uneducated communities that are extremely educated, learning from those, how has it changed us all in the process? We think in terms of, we're going to do this for Africa, we're going to do this for the communities that are marginalized. They're doing for us as well. I mean, we're all doing stuff for one another, right? And we haven't thought about it. There's no metrics that is created in evaluation spaces that tells that story. So despite this such a revolutionary, space that in which we are like, progressives and whatever, we're still so far away from, we're still carrying that embedded coloniality, what I have many times called the colonial debris. It's still there. So that's where I'll let Nyalleng carry on.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer, and we should continue offline or online in another conversation.
Yeah, thank you for all of those questions. I love I got caught with your closing word there, Professor Cossa. What is it? Colonial debris. That is definitely something to think about. But anyway, to my questions, I think my questions were around, so I was talking all these things about we have to do things for ourselves, we have to redefine the questions, we have to define the metrics and all of this. But I'm sitting inside an institution like Google, who exactly does them and how exactly do you do them? These kinds of questions. So I'm going to start off by saying that these kinds of questions are not only answered inside an institution like Google. First of all, so this is the reason we have these kinds of networks. This is the reason, for example, I participate in Black in AI, and I've participated from when they first started it, when Timnit and Rediet first started this organization. Because what the purpose of that organization is once again to empower Black people into AI and all like different aspects of AI, from fundamental research to ethics of the research itself. And I think it's so important that we sit in all the spaces of the pipeline so that we always know the truth, so that we can always refute if we are being told what is not true. And I think sometimes as Africans, or as Black people, this is something that we kind of just have to just be on the lookout for. Unfortunately, this is our inheritance of having to audit systems to make sure the systems are properly representing us. And so this kind of work that I'm speaking about, so when I speak here, because we're talking about AI in Africa, I'm speaking to the Africans, and I'm speaking about like the ideas that I have in my head and the things that that drive me to still be in this space. But I think there is, of course, restrictions about how much you can do given your space. But I also think it's very important that we sit in the diversity of the spaces, that some are sitting in academia, some are sitting in these tech companies, some are sitting in grassroots, some are sitting in startups, you know, all of these different spaces that we're sitting in. I think it's important that we all sit in these spaces, but more important is that we have this glue that puts us together. And so this is why organizations like Black in AI and the Deep Learning Endeavor. So for example, for us in the Deep Learning Endeavor, we started off as a summer school, like academic summer school. We were going to do the fundamentals of it. But in time, we started to integrate people that came in from industry, people that came in that were running startups, because what we need to do is to build an ecosystem that is self-sustaining. We need to, because if you are the only person who is sitting in the room and you are saying something against the whole deluge of other people who are saying something else, it's very difficult to move that agenda. So even though I sit inside Google and we don't have all, you know, we are not, like, you don't have as high representation of Black women inside Google as maybe you have elsewhere. But the fact that I know that there is this other organization of people who are, you know, doing all of this kinds of work means that I am still connected in that. And internally, I can still raise these kinds of opinions that I have because of who I am and where I come from, start being part of the conversation inside this company, inside these kinds of organization. And I think sometimes just getting that moving and just getting that started. So for example, obviously some of these kinds of questions we're not being asked until we open the Africa Lab, right? Like about how well are we doing on mapping these kinds of spaces, or how well are we doing on detecting diseases, on African sustenance, you know, like on African essential foods like cassava. Like cassava is not like a big plant, but in Africa, this is an integral plant. So in the little ways that we certainly can center the questions that matter the most to us. And I have to say, for the most part, because where we are sitting is supposed to be an academic research office, as long as we're doing the fundamentals of science, we have been allowed to continue asking the questions that are interesting for us. I don't know how long these kinds of things are sustainable for. I don't know how long, you know, one has this kind of runway. I don't know if the company is going to change towards this way of doing things or away from that. We don't know, but this is where we are right now. But I think also what's important is that we have learned how it works at those companies which influence so much of what's going on. And so we have been there, we have sat on the table, and we have participated there. And so, and I think that helps, and I think that changes, and I think that changes the ideas of even the people who are not sitting inside these companies about the validity of their own explorations. So I think it's a community effort, and we just have, we all just balancing and doing with the things we can carry, and trying to make the best out of all of this. But it is such a healthy community of people. It is such a healthy community, like both Black in AI and Deep Learning Endeavor. These are in machine learning and in AI. These are such big organizations which have a lot of power. Yeah, so that much. I mean, this is miles from when I know I got started like 10 years ago. This is, all the colleagues I have even in other companies, all the colleagues that we have in academic spaces, it feels more hopeful, and that our way of thinking, our evaluation, the things we're asking for and saying, no, you cannot leave out that data point. That data point is important. That's starting to be integrated. And it's getting integrated not just because we work for Google, but also because all of the other people outside are saying that.
Thank you for the answer. So Charles, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the next question?
Sure, thank you. This discussion has been very interesting to me. I was born in Ghana, but grew up in East and Southern Africa. And, you know, a lot of the concepts of Ubuntu are very near and dear to my heart. I'm a agnostic humanist. And having always been obsessed with technology and science fiction, it was really amazing to see the dispersal of technology throughout the African regions. But there's still this north and south divide of access. And I love that you brought up the issue of like satellites. I work with engineers, and some of the issues of access to satellite data, which would actually give us enough information to better plan our agriculture, and even using the machine learnings to better predict where the rainfall is coming in, where we're losing rainfall, how that affects the water table, and regions where droughts are forming. Planning those things is not just only machine learning we're needing. We need human beings in unison with the technologies. Right now I work in medical robotics, and it's the same. You don't just have a machine that's automated doing all these things. You need human beings to interpret things that they're finding. So the question I had for Nyalleng was, as these issues are coming up, is infrastructure being built that enables the average person who is, interested in, GIS to, spin up a machine, log in, download the Git repository, build the software? Is there any infrastructure being put in place for them to access the database behind it so that they can participate in a meaningful way to share back to the community, whether it's the science community, the technology community, which for people like me, it's very indistinguishable. But is that kind of thing happening currently? Thank you.
I'm actually not aware of any on the ground. I think because the kind of satellite imagery that you need is temporal, because you want to know, like, timepieces. It needs to be that, and not just now the open source satellite images that I am aware of. I don't actually I don't actually know the state at which they are right now. But the last time I used them, which was in conjunction with the spatial apartheid work, that was about maybe 3 years ago. I am not actually sure that you can use them as well for what you might want to do. For example, monitoring drought or crops or something like that. One, because the quality is not as good as the other satellite imagery that maybe, will show you what New York looks like. And then two, because they are so infrequent. They are so infrequently taken, like these like specific. So there's like, even when you go on like any mapping system, you can see that certain places are updated faster than others, or like more frequent than others. And so about this, like I said, internally, there are certain projects that people will speak up for and certain things that people will ask for. But I think this has got to be maybe one of those efforts that we raise resources for, and make sure that we can actually do this. I know there is, for example, there's a really good project that uses drones, but this is only in Tanzania. So Tanzania actually has really good satellite imagery if you want that as a test base, and because they use drones, so they're beautiful. They're very clear. You can actually use them. But I don't know what other place that maybe has them. But I can say organizations such as Black in AI, once again, I know I'm like promoting them a lot, and the Indaba. So one of the things we did this year in the Indaba is that we ran a whole campaign on African diseases that are understudied. And specifically, there's this other one, which name I can't say, is a skin disease. And this is a campaign for which we raise funds. And so this is a way to appeal to some of these tech companies actually to get funding from them. So that's what we do at the Indaba. We raise funds from like these big donors, and then we support a certain mission. So something like this is something that people can get together with all, because that's what we need. We just need people to talk to people. And so you just need to send an email to somebody who probably has a lot more sway than you, or has a lot more access to resources than you. And there are all of these organizations that are there, like AI for Development Africa. It's an institution that has budget. And I think this has got to be a community effort, because I don't know if this is a top research question for the big companies that have money. Like, unless, you know, we get to a space where we can motivate for it internally also. But, you know, but in which space then, you know, like a lot of the things then belong to the company. So this would be one of those. Like, if we want a rich data set to work on, this would be something that I think we as the community can work on. This is what a lot of people are doing. Like, there's a whole community of people that are studying African languages because they were so understudied. And they have raised so much funding. And there's all these researchers sitting all over the continent, and they're all one thing. They call themselves Masahani. And they're all working together, collaborating. And so now there is research about African languages, there's mapping, there's translation, there's energy behind it. And actually now people are starting to pay attention to it. So I think that's what we have to do.
Any plans to petition Elon Musk to hand over some of his satellite telemetry and ground data?
For Elon Musk. One, obviously, I don't know him. And two, I don't think he is not a fan of South Africa very much. So that's strike number two. But anyway, no. But obviously, but I think we undermine the power, the social capital we have right now as all of these people here that are sitting on this table right now. And more that are not on this table right now. I think we're undermining the social capital that's there. So many people have built so much, and we do have something to tap into, and we have to tap into it. And the nice thing is that it's a positive loop. Once there's momentum on something, then we get support, more and more support on it. So I think, yeah. But if somebody knows Elon, by all means, I mean, we'll take his money.
Thank you very much for all the questions and the answers. There are a lot of really good questions in the chat, but due to time, we are unable to get to them all. We could try to compile them all and send them out. So please sign up to our mailing list. Again, I'll put the link to that in the chat. But one final question for Nyalleng is about how the youth can get involved in these things you're building. You know, we are thinking about the next generation builders, the next generation technology. So this calls into place the youth and our place in making this happen. How can the youth get involved with the work you're doing on the continent and in general, be part of the force behind all this?
So the question is, how do we get involved? How can people join up?
No, what is the role of the youth in making sure that we have more equitable, responsible AI on the continent and for the diaspora also?
Oh, yeah. No, I think the biggest thing is for people to just respect their problems. It's just and especially the young people, because they have actually grown up in this space where so much is technical. And so honestly, for them, the first thing would be, look at the problem that's there next to you. I advise people to not go digging for a problem that you've seen somebody makes billion in Silicon Valley. Sure, maybe, I don't know, if you do, go make a unicorn. But I think what's important right now is we have so many low-hanging fruit, so many problems where automation could be the answer for us. And I think this is the space that like young people should get into. But obviously, I think people should not try to go at this alone. I think people should go at it like in communities. People have organizations in schools, like young people have organizations in schools. And to reach out to some of these organizations, because people who start them, actually, they start them because they want to, like the interest is always to just build this network and to make it bigger and bigger and more self-sustaining. And so reach out to people, find out if somebody can plug you in somewhere, find out if somebody can share with you the resources. Yeah, so I think that's the biggest thing. Use up the social capital that's there. And I can tell you that a lot of people that kind of started when I did start, it's such a, I think it's a very quick burnout space, this area. And so like people are really looking, even like in the Indaba, we're kind of looking to just give the next people to run with it, put in their ideas. Like we're burned out. We've been fighting for so long, and fighting such big giants. We're just ready for the next people to come through. So I think younger people, like when they're ready, just say, just connect, just tweet at somebody, just write an email, and please help us and take over some of the stuff so we can rest a bit more.
Yeah, so younger people, when you're ready, just connect. So again, thank you all very much for coming to today's event. It was really informative. Thank you very much to our presenters, to everyone who came, to the African Studies Department, to the Data Science Institute, and to all our presenters and panelists. So at this point, you would like to bring the session to an end. Again, please connect with us if you want to have access to the recordings. I just put the link in the chat to sign up for our mailing list and also to check out our website. Thank you very much for attending today, and we'd like to connect sometime in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sharif. Wonderful event. Great job, AI for Africa, Wisconsin.